Howdy folks, welcome back to Bjorn's Mighty Thoughts, and today I have for you a video where I'm going to talk about the Panther tank. Specifically, the Panther tank is a main battle tank. Change my mind. I'm actually going to change your mind. Let's begin, shall we? So a lot of people consider the Centurion to be the first main battle tank, considering the British actually called it a universal tank, which was a tank that would do everything. Basically, at the time, the British had cavalry tanks and they had infantry tanks. And the British want to change things up and have a tank that would do both roles, mostly to simplify tank production. And it would also allow more tanks to be out there. Parts would be much more easier to supply to one tank, where at the time they had the Cromwell, they had the Comet, they had tanks like the Covenant are still in service. They still had the Senators. They had the Sherman in service. They had the Churchill, so on and so forth. So they want to simplify all that, make one tank to do all the roles where it could support infantry as well as punch through the enemy lines and maraud behind enemy lines. That was the general idea. So basically, we're going to take medium tanks and we're going to take heavy tanks and we're going to combine them into one role, call it a universal tank. Now, a lot of people consider this to be the great grandfather of the main battle tank. I want to argue that no, this is not the great granddad of the main battle tank. It's not the forefather. It's not the father of the main battle tank whatsoever. And I believe it's actually the Panther tank. I'm going to go through the process and explain why I believe it's the Panther tank over the Centurion. And understand too that the Panther, based on what source you look at, is either considered a medium tank or a heavy tank. And I'm going to explain why. The Germans used it generally as a medium tank. They categorized it as a medium tank. They did things differently than the rest of the world, although it's kind of hard to say that when the rest of the world kind of had various different standards. Now, the Soviets kind of went with the Americans, where the weight of the tank kind of dictated what role the tank was. Example would be the T-34. It was only around 30 tons. Actually, I believe it was slightly over 30 tons. It was a faster moving tank. It wasn't extremely well armored, but it had armor. It had a decent gun, although you could argue that the 76 millimeter that the Soviets were using actually really wasn't that good of a gun. As you can see later, they would have the 85 millimeter on the T-34, and generally the early T-34s really wasn't a very good design, and I could argue with that and maybe even possibly explain later in another video of why I believe that the early T-34s was actually a poor design of a tank. But so they weighed in around 30 tons, give or take. I'm not exactly sure of the tonnage off the top of my head. I'll get into the actual tonnage later of the T-34. But then you would also have tanks like the IS-2 that weighed in near 60 tons. And they were a heavy breakthrough tank. They were well armored. They had a heavy, hard-hitting gun. But they weren't extremely fast. Now, the Soviet heavy tanks versus the German heavy tanks. The German heavy tanks definitely did not maneuver as well as the Soviet heavy tanks, but the Soviet heavy tanks was more built around the idea of a fast-moving, well-armored assault tank. The Americans, we did actually have some heavy tanks in World of Tanks. You see the M6. The M6 was actually a heavy tank that was produced by America during World War II. It just would not see service actually in war. They built like 34 of them, if I recall the numbers correctly, and they never left America. They were never transported overseas. Instead, because of the weight of the tank and transporting overseas, it was decided to keep those tanks here in America because for each M6 you ship, you could actually ship 2 Shermans. They just kind of went with the whole process of it's easier to ship Shermans. We can ship a lot more Shermans than we can M6 tanks, so on and so forth, so the M6 would never get over there. Now, on the other side of the coin, you have the British, which their tanks, they did theirs more of by a category. You either had okayish firepower, and I'm going to say okayish because all the British tanks are really okayish in the realm of firepower. None of them are really superior, especially to the Germans, or even some of the Soviet stuff. But you would actually either take a lack of armor for speed, hence his cavalry tank, or you would take armor and firepower for a lack of speed as a breakthrough tank, which would be an infantry tank. One was designed to support infantry. It wasn't fast moving. The tank was never meant to be fast moving, i.e. the Valentine, Churchill, Matilda. They were all infantry tanks. And then you would have tanks like the Cromwell and the Comet, which would be a cavalry tank. They'd be a faster moving tank. They weren't really designed or built to be an infantry support vehicle. Instead, they were meant to go through the enemy lines and maraud around with their incredible speed. Now, in the German realm of things, while they had heavy tanks and medium tanks and categorized them as such, their tanks was more designed around a role. To them, a heavy tank or a breakthrough tank like the Tiger was meant to have heavy armor and firepower. And then tanks like the Panther and the Panzer was meant to be a faster moving tank. It didn't have the firepower or the armor that tanks like the Tiger had, although they were still pretty decent, which I'm going to explain more about it. But basically what it comes down to is they didn't categorize their tanks by a weight class, which is one confusion I would say between the Panther tank and what category it really fits in, because depending upon what resource you look at, if they follow the German standards or how the Germans categorized the Panther, it was actually a medium tank. But depending upon what resource you look at, if they go by the weight class like America did, it kind of goes in the role of a heavy tank. And I'll show a bit more of that here in a bit. Now, let's start with one thing. I want to bust a myth right off the bat here before I really get into terminologies, statistics, and everything else. A lot of people believe that the Panther actually came about, more or less was designed and came about because of the T-34. I actually want to bust that myth right out of the water. And this is how I'm going to explain it. A replacement for the Panzer III and Panzer IV would begin in 1940. The plan would begin with a 20-ton weight class tank given the project code VK2001M. VK, abbreviation for Voltketten, or fully tracked, and M was an abbreviation for MAN, Man Corporation. This would be followed by the weight class and subvariant. The weight class being the first number, 20, which means 20 ton, and variant would be the variant of the prototype. The Panther prototype code was VK3002M. So actually the Panther was actually, the Panther prototype was actually the second variant. The first variant, which was VK3001D, which was a Daimler-Benz model. It was very close to the Panther, but not quite identical to the Panther. Drawings of the VK3002M was dated May 2nd, 1942. So I'm going to use this here. Now, I couldn't find good drawings or photographs of the VK2001. This is actually the VK2001D, which is a Daimler-Benz model. As you can see, it started incorporating slightly improved sloped armor compared to the Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs. And this was actually marketed as an early prototype replacement for the Panzer III, Panzer IV. The reason I'm pointing this out is because actually a replacement for Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs actually began in 1940. even before the production of the T-34s. Now, you can go either way with this because the man prototype would actually come May 2nd, 1942. And a lot of the stuff that was incorporated in this tank was actually inspired by what they had learned and encountered with the T-34s. So all in all, in the end, what I'm trying to get at is yes, while this was the final production model would be inspired by the T-34, realistically, replacements started sooner, and the Germans might have actually come along to this model by themselves without ever seeing the T-34s. Now, this is a drawing here. Here's an image of most likely what it would have looked like. World of Tanks actually, I felt, did a really good job on the model. As you can see, it definitely looks very close to being a Panther. There's actually a couple little details I see that's different on this versus what the actual production Panther would look like. And most likely this was either based off the drawings, well, probably a combination of the drawings, and possibly a wooden mock-up. I know the VK3001D was actually based on a wooden mock-up. I did find photographs of the wooden mock-up, even though they're not actually really all that good to show here. But even the wooden mock-up of the VK 3001D would look very similar to what the Panther would become. And all in all, in the end, this is what you would get from the VK 3002M. This would be the Panther. Now let's dig into some statistics here so I can make a clear case of why I believe the Panther is actually a main battle tank versus actually being considered as a medium tank or a heavy tank. And one thing I do want to point out too is that the Panther was actually meant to replace both the Panzer III and Panzer IV. Now, while Panzer IIIs would be pulled from service, the Panzer IV would actually stay in service throughout the war, mostly because they couldn't produce Panthers fast enough. Panthers were high demand and maintenance, and I can get into more on that. Maybe I'll make a video on that too. So we're going to start with terminology here first. Medium tank was a term used to describe a tank weighing 25 to 35 tons, reasonably well armored and armed with good all-round performance, i.e. M4 Sherman, T-34, Panzer IV. Now, this is closer to late model Panzer IVs. The early model Panzer IV was actually a support tank with its short 75 millimeter gun. It was designed to actually fire high explosive ammunition. So there is that. The early model Panther IV was actually not an anti-tank Panzer. Instead, it was the Panzer III that was the anti-tank Panzer with its high velocity 50 millimeter gun that would shoot armor piercing ammunition. Now, a heavy tank with increased armor and equal or greater firepower than a medium tank, often at the cost of maneuverability and speed. A tank of this class was also known as a breakthrough tanks. Generally, a heavy tank weighing around 50 to 60 tons and up, i.e. Tiger, IS-2, M26 Pershing, and Cane Tiger. Now, M26 Pershing is kind of an oddball here. I'm going with the World War II statistics of the M26 Pershing, mostly because right now I'm focusing on World War II tanks. And actually in World War II, the M26 Pershing was considered a heavy tank. Later in Korea, it would be recategorized as a medium tank. So we're going to start here with armor protection. As you can see, the Panther's on the top. Now, it varies 80 millimeter to 100 millimeter with a 55-degree slope. Now, the reason I want to point out that it's 80 millimeter to 100 millimeters because the early model Panthers the upper plate was only 80 millimeters. The later final production Panthers was actually 100 millimeter thick plate. But as you can see here, looking over the stats, it's actually got better protection than even the early model Panthers has better protection than the Tiger, considering adding in the sloping. to its 80 millimeter thick plate. And it's actually a lighter tank. Now there's some sacrifices here. The rear and sides was much thinner than it was for the Tiger. Uh, Things of that nature. Now it did have better sloping. You'd also see here now the M4A3E8. That's a late model Sherman, and that actually has much better protection than even the Tiger itself. However, its protection isn't even good as the Panther. Now the T-34-85. This one's an oddball. So the hull for the T-34-85s was never really redesigned. The 47 millimeter thick upper glacis plate was actually the hull from the early T-34s. And they didn't redesign the hulls. Instead, they redesigned the turret. So they have a ridiculously thick armored turret, but a thin armored hull. Of course, it's still well sloped. Then you got the Cromwell here with 76 millimeters, but it is not sloped at all. I know the Tiger I have. If you look at the Tiger and the Panzer IV, they say that they're not sloped. However, if you look at drawings closely, you will see that the upper plate actually is sloped slightly, not much. 10 degrees might be an overstatement, to be honest. And then you'd have the Cane Tiger here with the top overall armor. This is just to set a baseline of armor protection of the upper glacis plate. I didn't get any turret thicknesses for anyone. The problem with trying to get turret thicknesses is some of these vehicles, like the Cromwell, doesn't have a gun mantlet at all. The Sherman has a gun mantlet, very thick gun mantlet, very strong turret. But tanks like the T-34-85 with its somewhat rounded turret front, and even the Panther with its rounded gun mantlet, the thickness actually varies based on where you want to put your point. So it was hard to get good, accurate turret face numbers. So I focused on the hull numbers. And if you look at photographs of tanks from World War II, more often than not, the tank was penetrated actually in the hull. So that's why I went with the hull numbers, just to give you a baseline of protection. Now, here's the speed of the different tanks. Now, the early model Panthers that came out, they would reach 34 miles per hour. This is on pretty much flat paved road. That's what the speeds are in, and they're in miles per hour. The later model Panthers that had the thicker plate were actually a little bit slower, mostly due to the increased armor protection. The Sherman was a hard one to track down because there's so many variants of Shermans with so many different engines. There's no baseline, and that's even the same way with the weight of the Sherman. 38.1, that's actually probably a Sherman jumbo. But once again, it was hard to pin down a good, accurate numbers for a specific model of Sherman. Pardon me. And then you'd have the T-34-85, and I put in the Panzer III, which the Panzer III wasn't around for the Panther, really. It was kind of pulled from service before that point. But it gives you a baseline that actually the Panther, even though it was a much heavier tank than the Panzer III, was actually a much more mobile tank than the Panzer III. Of course, there's more tonnage, so more protection. And that's actually the same case here with the Panzer IV. Even though the Panzer IV was in service in time around the time of the Panther, it still kind of gives you a speed and ton protection ratios and things of that nature. And then I also threw the Cromwell in here. The Cromwell is a pretty fast tank, and it's mobility-wise, it's superior in every way to the Panther. But as you can see here, actually, the Panther's pretty superior to a lot of these tanks. And actually, it did actually have around the same power-to-weight ratio as the T-34-85 and even the Sherman. So it was actually a quite mobile tank for being the heaviest tank on this list. Just another one of those things, setting up a baseline here. And then here we go. We're going to go with firepower. Now, with the Panther, you get the KWK-42 L70, 75 millimeter. And and you have the PZGR round 3942, and I give you the penetration numbers and the whole 9 yards. I'm not going to get in depth here. If you want to, take a moment, pause the video, go over the stats. But basically what you have here overall is, while the Panther doesn't necessarily have the best penetration over any of these vehicles, it does have a clear, it's kind of the middle of the road of being the best for penetration and firepower over a lot of these vehicles, considering that the 90 millimeter is a much bigger gun than the 75 millimeter, and that's APC ammo. Also, one thing I want to point out too is this is actually the early, more or less early baseline ammos. Now with the Panzer IV-H, with the APCBC, that's actually a late model ammo for the KWK 40 L48. That's not an early ammo. And so on and so forth. You have the Soviet ammo here, which even the Soviet ammo, while within 100 meters, it is superior to the Panther's 75 millimeter gun. As you can see, over distance of 500 meters, they're very similar. And by 1,000 meters, the Panther actually over the Panther 75 millimeter gun overtakes the AP ammunition of the Soviet 85 millimeter gun. But I just want to put a baseline here, show you what's out there. The 17 pounder actually really overshouts everything short of the 90 millimeter gun. And then it gives you the penetration figures for an armored plate of 30 degrees for vertical. So basically a 30-degree sloped plate. So I'm giving you here a baseline of maneuverability, armor protection, and firepower. And when you consider the Panther throughout the three data images here I give you, as you can see, it's very baseline and well-rounded compared to the other tanks. So now, how does Panther compare to an early Centurion Mark I, which was considered a main battle, well, a universal tank, the great grandfather of main battle tanks? Well, the late model Panther and the Centurion Mark I, the Panther actually compares quite favorably to the Centurion, even though the Centurion is a heavier tank. Now, one thing I want to point out is the Centurion, when you look at the protection numbers here, once again, this is just the upper glacis plate, and it's sloping. I think 55 degrees is a little off. It looks more like 50 to me on the Centurion. It might be even less still. But the data I pulled said 55 degrees, so I ran with it. But as you can see, the Panther actually has, in at least the upper glacis plate, a clear advantage over the post-World War II Centurion. And then with the KWK 42 L70 75 millimeter gun, this is actually the later model ammunition. And while the 17 pounder, once again, this is later model, the APDS round, this is a late model round. This is actually a post-war round. It still compares, the Panther still compares favorably. Now, in all honesty, the 17 pounder overshadows, but consider they had quite a few more years to develop the 17 pounder ammunition than they did the 75 millimeter ammunition. So what I'm getting at here with the Panther, the thing to understand with the main battle tank is, after the war and we started using the terminology main battle tank was kind of a tank that did all the different jobs that a medium tank or a heavy tank would do. Panther essentially did that. It had decent mobility. It had decent firepower. It had decent armor protection, especially on the frontal arc, which is really mostly considered the most important arc. A lot of the times you sacrifice side armor and rear armor for the additional frontal protection. And that's essentially where I'm going with this. And that's why I believe actually the Panther tank is actually the father of the main battle tank. The Panther, especially towards the end of the war, was used for everything. It was used in roles that it wasn't necessarily considered to be used for, such as spearhead maneuvers and breakthrough maneuvers. They used it multiple times in Europe against the Allies for breakthrough maneuvers, where actually a Tiger or a Cane Tiger should have been in its place, or more or less the Germans would have liked by German doctrine in its place. Um, it had the superior firepower against most of the Allied tanks. It had as I said, very decent protection and even speed. It was actually considered a very mobile tank for its weight. And as you can see, for top speeds, now once again, those top speeds were by flat road. Um, it was still very favorable for the Panther. But anyway, folks, that is the end of the video. I know the video was a little long here. Hopefully everybody enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. Yeah, hopefully I'll see you for the next video.